I exposed my wife's affair with a divorce letter right in front of her lover. There's a certain kind of silence that falls over you when your world shifts in a way you never expected. That's the silence Alex found himself sitting in when he discovered his wife, Emily, was having an affair. To everyone else, Alex and Emily seemed like a solid couple, years of marriage, children, and what most people would call a stable, loving home. But as Alex soon learned, even the strongest walls can hide deep cracks. It all started small, a few things here and there that didn't feel right. Emily was a little too secretive with her phone, a bit too quick to brush off late nights with vague excuses. He'd noticed her texting late into the night, her phone screen lighting up her face with a strange glow of secrecy. It was like she was slowly slipping away, but no matter how much he reached out, she pulled further back. At first, he thought it was stress. Work pressures, family obligations, maybe even a phase. But as days turned to weeks, his gut feeling grew stronger, and he couldn't shake off the feeling that something was deeply wrong. So, Alex did what he never thought he'd have to do. He quietly started paying attention, looking for signs, hoping he was wrong. He wanted to be wrong. But then, he found the evidence he feared: hotel receipts, texts he'd forgotten to delete. Each one was like a piece of a puzzle he didn't want to solve. A few messages between Emily and a name he'd never seen before, Chris. And the things they said, the plans they made, it was all there in his hands, a painful reality he couldn't ignore. Instead of reacting with anger, Alex did something most wouldn't. He didn't scream or throw accusations. He didn't even confront Emily right away. Instead, he planned a confrontation she'd never forget, one that would leave her with no doubt about the pain she caused. He wanted her to feel the impact of her betrayal just as he had. And so he sat down, wrote a letter, one that wasn't full of rage, but a simple statement of fact. He wanted a divorce. But he wasn't going to leave it there. He wanted to confront her, face to face, but not at home. He wanted her to understand the weight of her actions in the very place where her affair had taken life. He wanted her to see him there, to realize just how exposed and vulnerable her actions had left their family. And so, Alex made his plan. He followed her one evening as she left the house, his heart heavy yet steady. He knew where she was going, the restaurant she frequented with Chris. As he walked through the doors, he saw them together, laughing, oblivious to the heartbreak sitting just a few tables away. He took a deep breath, steadied himself, and made his way to their table, building suspicion and discovering the affair. After that initial shock, Alex couldn't look at Emily the same way. Every small interaction, every laugh or smile, felt strange, forced, as if there was something lurking underneath. It wasn't that she had suddenly become a stranger, but there was a new distance between them, one he could feel even if he couldn't explain it. And once that feeling took root, it only grew. At first, it was subtle things. Emily seemed more distracted, often glued to her phone in ways that didn't add up. She'd rush out of the room to answer calls, brush off messages she claimed were from work, or laugh at things she'd never explained. Her once warm gaze now seemed far away, like she was always somewhere else, someplace he couldn't reach. One night, he asked her directly, "Are you okay? You seem different." She looked surprised but then smiled, brushing it off. "Just tired, that's all. Work's been rough." And maybe for a moment, he wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe it was just stress, that maybe he was reading too much into things. But doubt has a way of digging its roots in deep. Then each passing day brought something new that didn't quite sit right. Then came the nights when she'd be out late, supposedly for meetings or catch-ups with friends. He would stay up, waiting for her to come home, watching the clock tick past midnight. She'd walk in, hair slightly tousled, cheeks flushed. And though she'd always have an excuse, there was something in her eyes, something that made his stomach drop. One night, as she slept, Alex found himself pacing the kitchen. His mind was racing, but he didn't want to jump to conclusions. He didn't want to be that kind of husband, the one who pries and digs. But then again, he thought, maybe he needed to know the truth, even if it hurt. Maybe especially if it hurt. So he did the thing he promised himself he'd never do. He looked at her phone, just for a moment, just to confirm what he hoped wasn't true. What he found was more than enough. Messages from a man named Chris, a name he'd never heard her mention before. And they weren't just friendly chats. These were intimate messages, filled with plans, promises, and inside jokes he didn't understand. They spoke about dinners, late nights, and stolen moments. Moments that he realized with a hollow ache should have been his. It felt like the ground was pulled from beneath him. He sat there, staring at the screen, his mind buzzing, heart pounding. All the moments he dismissed, all the tiny doubts he brushed aside, they all came crashing down at once, too loud to ignore. Over the next few days, he watched her more closely, trying to find some explanation, some reason for her actions. But the more he saw, the clearer it became. She was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He noticed how she'd perk up whenever she got a message, her face lighting up in ways he hadn't seen in a long time. How she'd go out of her way to look her best on meeting nights, wearing perfume she rarely wore at home. There was a new energy in her, a kind of excitement that had been missing from their relationship for some time. And while he could see that she was happy, it wasn't a happiness she shared with him anymore. One afternoon, as he sat alone at home, the reality of it all sank in. This wasn't just a passing phase. This was real. His wife was involved with someone else, and she hadn't even tried to hide it. A part of him wanted to confront her, to make her see the pain she was causing. But another part of him felt numb, empty, like he had already lost her. And maybe in a way, he had. It was then that Alex decided he couldn't just let this go. He couldn't pretend everything was fine, couldn't keep lying to himself. He had to confront her, but not in a way that would erupt into yelling and accusations. That wasn't his style, and he didn't want to leave his dignity behind in this mess. No, he wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done, to understand the betrayal without him having to scream it out. So he started planning, thinking through how he could make the moment meaningful, impactful. He didn't just want her to hear his pain. He wanted her to see it, feel it in a way she couldn't ignore. And so, he began to write the letter. Each word came slowly, carefully. He poured his heartbreak into it, but he kept his tone steady, calm, letting the words speak for themselves. This was his way of saying goodbye to the woman he once knew, the woman he thought would be by his side forever. Once he finished, he felt an odd sense of peace. He knew it would hurt, but he also knew he couldn't keep pretending. He deserved more than secrets and half-truths. He deserved honesty, and if she couldn't give it to him, he'd find a way to take it for himself. And so, with the letter in hand, he waited for the right moment, the right place. He knew where they met, the restaurant they frequented, the one where they'd share laughs he'd never hear. That was where he would go, and that's where he'd leave the letter. A final message of goodbye. Preparing for the confrontation. With the divorce letter in hand, Alex felt something shift inside him, a quiet resolve. He knew this was going to be painful, but he was past the point of fear. Now, it was about setting things right, about giving Emily the honesty he felt she no longer deserved from him. And in a way, it was about reclaiming control over his own life, his own story. He thought about their years together, the memories that now felt distant, almost like scenes from someone else's life. He didn't want to yell or make a scene. He wasn't interested in public embarrassment. Instead, he wanted her to understand the depth of his hurt without having to say it out loud. The letter, he hoped, would say everything that needed saying. So, he rehearsed it in his mind. How he would walk into that restaurant, how he would set the letter down. He imagined the look on her face, the shock and realization. He wanted her to feel exposed, to realize that the lie she had been living was no longer a secret. The day he planned to confront her, he took his time getting ready. He dressed simply, nothing flashy, just his usual self, as if it were any other day. But as he looked in the mirror, he felt different. There was a weight in his chest, a heaviness that reminded him of everything he was about to let go of. This wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about closing a chapter of his life that he had once thought would last forever. He left the house with a calm resolve. On the drive to the restaurant, he thought of their children, of the life they had built together, and the life they would now have to navigate separately. He knew this decision wasn't only about him. It was about protecting what remained of their family, about showing his kids that respect and honesty matter, even when it hurts. When he arrived at the restaurant, he took a deep breath before walking in. It was a familiar place, one they had been to many times before. He felt a pang of nostalgia as he stepped inside, but he quickly pushed it away, focusing on the task at hand. He scanned the room until he found them, sitting together at a small table in the corner. They looked comfortable, relaxed, laughing in a way that made his stomach turn. With every step toward them, he felt his heart beat a little harder, but he kept his face calm, his eyes steady. He wasn't here to argue or explain. He was here to make his point, to give her the honesty she had denied him for so long. When he reached their table, Emily looked up, her laughter fading as she saw him standing there. The color drained from her face, and her eyes widened, filled with shock and maybe, just maybe, a hint of guilt. Alex didn't say a word. He simply placed the envelope on the table, right between her and Chris, and looked her in the eye. The silence between them was heavy, loaded with everything he felt but wouldn't say. Emily's mouth opened slightly as if she wanted to speak, to explain, but no words came out, and he could see it. the moment she understood exactly what that letter meant. It wasn't just paper. It was an end. With one last glance, Alex turned and walked away, his step steady, his head held high. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The message was clear. On his way out, he felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. He hadn't caused a scene, hadn't let anger take over. He had handled it on his terms, and he hoped in some way that Emily would understand what she had lost. As he left the restaurant and walked into the cool evening air, he felt the weight in his chest start to ease. This wasn't the future he'd planned, but it was a future he could live with. One built on truth, however painful. Restaurant scene, watching Emily's reaction and Chris' revelation. As Alex walked out of the restaurant, he couldn't resist looking back through the large front window. He knew this was the moment when everything would start to unravel for Emily, and he wanted to see her reaction. Maybe as a way to find closure, or maybe just to understand if there was any regret in her heart. From his vantage point, he watched Emily as she slowly reached for the envelope he had placed between her and Chris. She glanced at it, then at Chris, confusion clear on her face. He saw her hands tremble slightly as she opened it, unfolding the paper with a shaky breath. And then he saw it, the moment of realization. Her face went pale as her eyes scanned the letter, absorbing each word. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a reality she could no longer deny. It was the truth she had tried to hide, now laid bare in front of her lover. Emily's gaze shot up to Chris, as if searching for an answer, a way out. But Alex noticed something in Chris' expression that caught him off guard. Chris didn't look shocked or even apologetic. Instead, he seemed uncomfortable, like he was witnessing something he had expected but hoped wouldn't happen. It was a strange moment, watching his wife's affair partner react with such detachment. Alex felt a wave of anger rise in him, anger at both of them for turning his life into a painful spectacle. But that anger quickly turned to curiosity as he continued to observe. Chris seemed to be shifting in his seat, avoiding Emily's gaze, like he was trying to escape without making a scene. And then, Emily did something that left Alex both stunned and oddly vindicated. She began asking Chris in a low but desperate voice, questions he could almost make out through the glass. From her body language, Alex could tell she was demanding answers, maybe about his loyalty or intentions. But Chris's response was cold, dismissive, and he kept glancing toward the door as if planning his exit. It didn't take long for Emily to realize she was alone in her devastation. The man she had trusted, the one she had risked her family for, was now pulling away, clearly uninterested in supporting her through the fallout. Alex watched as her face went from anger to confusion, then finally to shock, a look of complete betrayal. Suddenly, the pieces began to fall into place for Alex. He'd had his suspicions about Chris, wondering what his true intentions were, but he'd never pursued those thoughts too deeply. Now, watching from outside, it became painfully clear that Chris had never cared about her the way she had imagined. To him, Emily was just another step, a useful tool in some plan he had crafted for himself. Emily's reaction, though, was what struck Alex the most. She was looking at Chris with a mixture of betrayal and disbelief, her eyes brimming with the same pain he had felt just days before. He almost wanted to feel sympathy for her, but the memory of her deceit was still too fresh, too raw. Instead, he felt an odd sense of justice, as if she was finally experiencing the consequences of her choices in the harshest way possible. Then, as if unable to bear it any longer, Chris stood up, pushing his chair back with a hasty scrape. He didn't even look at Emily as he grabbed his jacket and began walking toward the exit. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass, Alex's and Chris's, and in that brief exchange, Alex saw nothing but a hollow indifference in Chris's gaze. There was no apology, no remorse, only the same detachment he had shown toward Emily. And with that, Chris walked out of her life as quickly as he had entered. Emily sat there, alone at the table, the divorce letter in one hand and tears started to gather in her eyes. She looked lost, broken, a carefully crafted world shattering around her in a way she had never expected. For the first time, Alex felt a strange release, a sense that he had done what he needed to do, and that the rest was now hers to live. With a heavy but calm heart, he turned away from the window, ready to walk back into his own life, leaving her to deal with the reality she had created. As he walked to his car, he felt the weight of sadness, but there was also a flicker of relief, a sense that he could finally start to heal, to rebuild. The ride home was quiet, almost peaceful, as if the storm that had been raging in his mind had finally begun to settle. He thought about what he'd just seen, about Emily's shock and the betrayal she'd experienced at Chris's hands. He He knew it would be a long time before the pain slowly faded, but for now, he was content with the truth. It was a harsh, unforgiving truth, but it was his reality, and he was ready to face it head on. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he felt a calm acceptance settle over him. This wasn't the life he had planned, but it was the life he now had, and he was determined to make the best of it, for himself and for his children. Confrontation, fallout, and immediate reactions. As Alex walked through his front door that night, the silence of his home felt heavier than ever. He was finally alone with his thoughts, away from the scene he had just left behind. It was over. The confrontation, the exposure, it had all unfolded just as he planned, yet the sense of finality left a deep, hollow ache. He moved through the house in a kind of daze, passing by family photos, little reminders of the life he had shared with Emily. It was strange, seeing their smiles frozen in time, as if they belonged to a different story, one that had ended long before he realized it. For a moment, he wondered how Emily was feeling, sitting alone at that restaurant, facing the reality of what she had done. Part of him wanted her to feel the weight of the betrayal she had put him through. But another part, a softer part, almost pitied her. She hadn't just lost him. She had lost herself, blinded by someone who didn't care, used and discarded when she was no longer convenient. But Alex knew that pity wasn't what he needed right now. He needed strength, the kind of inner resolve that would keep him moving forward for the sake of his children. They were the ones he would fight for, the reason he wouldn't let this break him. Later that night, as he lay in bed, the memories of the evening replayed in his mind. He pictured her face as she read the letter, the shock, the confusion, and finally, the hurt. He knew she hadn't expected him to find out, much less confront her in such a public way. And the look on her face when Chris walked away, that would stay with him for a long time. But as painful as it was, he reminded himself that this was the closure he needed. He had given her honesty, the truth she had tried to hide from him, and in doing so, he had taken the first step toward healing, even if that path would be long and uncertain. Over the next few days, Emily tried to reach out. She called, left messages, even showed up at the house once, asking to talk. But Alex was firm. He told her that he wasn't ready, that he needed space to process everything. He could tell she was struggling, but he knew this was her burden to bear, her consequence to face. He spent his days focusing on the little things that mattered, trying to reclaim a sense of normalcy for himself and for his children. There were moments of sadness, anger, even moments of doubt. But through it all, he held on to the quiet strength that had brought him this far. In the end, Alex knew that this wasn't just an ending. It was a new beginning, one that he would build on his terms, without lies or betrayal. And as he took each step forward, he began to feel a sense of hope, a small but steady light guiding him toward a life he could call his own. Aftermath, reflection, and consequences. In the days that followed, Alex tried to settle into a new routine. There was a strange quietness to his life now, a kind of emptiness that was both freeing and heavy at the same time. He'd lost the future he had built in his mind, but he was also finding moments of peace, even if they were small. His priority was his children. They didn't know the details, but they could sense that something was off. He was honest with them in a way that protected their hearts, but gave them the stability they needed. He'd say, "Mom and Dad are going through a hard time right now, but we love you, and we're here for you." And he kept his word, showing up for them in ways that helped keep their world steady. For Emily, however, the aftermath was different. She wasn't just dealing with the end of her marriage. She was wrestling with the reality of Chris' betrayal. She had put her trust in him, risked her family for him, only to be left abandoned when things got complicated. It was a harsh wake-up call, and she was left alone to pick up the pieces. The guilt weighed heavily on her. She began reaching out to Alex more, leaving messages asking to talk, to explain herself. But he wasn't ready to open that door. He needed time to heal on his own terms, without being drawn back into the pain she had caused. Emily could sense that she had hurt him deeply, more than she ever intended, and that knowledge became a constant ache in her chest. To make sense of it all, Emily decided to see a therapist. She needed someone to help her understand why she had made the choices she did, why she had risked everything for something that wasn't real. Therapy became a safe space for her to confront her actions, to face the truth of her decisions without excuses. Through those sessions, she began to see parts of herself she had ignored, insecurities, fears, things she had tried to escape through her relationship with Chris. But as she faced these truths, she also began to realize the damage she had done to Alex, the depth of the trust she had broken. She knew there was no quick fix, no way to undo the hurt, but she was determined to grow, even if it took time. For Alex, the journey was less about understanding Emily's choices and more about rediscovering himself. He had spent years defining his life as a husband, a partner, a family man, and now he was stepping into a role he hadn't planned for, a single parent, a man building a new life from scratch. He threw himself into his work, found new hobbies, and reconnected with old friends. There were tough days, days when the loneliness felt like too much, but there were also days when he felt a quiet strength, a sense that he was moving forward, step by step, leaving the hurt a little further behind each time. The distance between him and Emily grew, but it was a necessary space, one that allowed them both to start healing in their own ways. They kept things simple for the sake of the kids, exchanging polite greetings and discussing school events and family schedules. It was strange, this new normal, but it was a rhythm they could both manage. Over time, Alex began to see that forgiveness wasn't just about letting Emily off the hook. It was about freeing himself from the weight of what had happened. It didn't mean he forgot or that the pain disappeared, but it meant that he could look toward the future without carrying the past like a burden. For Emily, forgiveness was a different process. She struggled to forgive herself, to let go of the guilt that kept her awake at night. But as she continued with therapy, she began to accept that she couldn't change the past, only learn from it. She had lost Alex's trust, perhaps forever, but she could still become a better person for herself, for her children, and for the life she now had to rebuild. In the end, the consequences of their choices left a lasting impact on both of them. They were no longer the people they had once been, but perhaps that was okay. They had both grown, both changed, and while the scars would always remain, they were learning to live with them, to find meaning in the lessons they had learned. Alex and Emily continued on their separate paths, their lives no longer intertwined, but always connected by the family they had built together. And in that connection, they found a way to coexist, to move forward without bitterness, only acceptance. Moving forward and seeking healing. With each passing week, Alex found himself settling into a new rhythm, a life that felt both unfamiliar and freeing. It wasn't easy. He still woke up some days feeling the weight of everything he lost, of the family life he planned that was now gone. But alongside the sadness was something new, something that felt like hope. He focused on building a life for himself and his children. He began finding joy in the small, everyday moments, like teaching his kids to ride bikes, sharing meals together, and just being present with them in ways that mattered. These moments weren't just distractions. They became the core of his healing, reminding him of what truly mattered. Work became an anchor too. Alex poured himself into projects, rediscovering parts of himself that had been put aside for family obligations. He started picking up hobbies he'd always wanted to try. He even joined a local hiking group, spending weekends exploring trails he'd never seen before. There was a quiet peace in nature, a sense of calm that helped him feel grounded, even as he rebuilt his life one day at a time. For Emily, the journey was different. Therapy continued to be a constant in her life, a place where she could explore her own choices and face the reality of what she lost. She learned to take responsibility without letting guilt consume her, a delicate balance that took time and patience. It wasn't easy, facing herself in that way. She had to confront her insecurities, her fears, and all the things she had tried to escape by seeking attention outside her marriage. But as the weeks turned into months, she began to find clarity, to understand that her actions didn't define her forever. She still had the chance to grow, to be a better person, even if the road was long. One day, Emily called Alex, not to ask for forgiveness, but simply to acknowledge the pain she had caused. She told him how sorry she was, how she understood that she had broken something valuable. There was no grand gesture, no expectation of reconciliation, just a simple apology, a small step toward healing for both of them. Alex accepted her words with grace, knowing they couldn't erase the past, but could at least bring a sense of closure. It didn't make everything right, but it allowed him to let go of some of the bitterness, to make room for peace. In the months that followed, both Alex and Emily found ways to rebuild their lives, separately but respectfully. They continued to co-parent their children, sharing milestones and family events with a quiet understanding. It wasn't the life they had once dreamed of, but it was a life they could both live with. As Alex moved forward, he began to find a new kind of happiness, one that wasn't tied to anyone else's actions or approval. It was a life he was creating for himself, piece by piece, with a foundation built on honesty, resilience, and the hard-won peace that comes after a storm. Conclusion: the lingering pain of betrayal. Betrayal leaves scars, even long after the wounds have started to heal. For Alex and Emily, those scars would remain, a reminder of a love that had once been, and the trust that had been broken. But while the pain lingered, so did the lessons they had each learned. For Alex, the journey was about finding strength he hadn't known he possessed. He had faced heartbreak and loss, but he had come out the other side stronger, more grounded, and more aware of what he needed and deserved. He was no longer just a man defined by his role as a husband, but a person building a life that was truly his own. Emily, too, found a path forward, though it was one marked by regret and the hard truths of her choices. She carried the weight of her mistakes, but she also carried a new commitment to honesty, to self-awareness, and to becoming a better mother and person. Her journey was not about erasing the past, but learning from it, growing in a way that made her more mindful, more whole. In the end, their story was one of both loss and resilience. They had shared a life, a family, and though it hadn't ended as they once hoped, they had both found a way to move forward. The pain might never completely fade, but they had found a sense of peace, a quiet understanding that, even in brokenness, there was room for healing.